I'm feeling mighty lonesome, haven't slept a wink. I walk the floor and watch the door, and in between I drink black coffee.
Dear colleagues, dear interessants in philosophy, let me invite you to the Philosophical Café, a philosophical event which I organize every month, each first week in the month, Thursday from 4 p.m. I organize the gatherings of the researchers from Philosophical Institute and all interessants in philosophy from Prague. We are discussing vibrant themes of the open space of the society, which are interesting for broad audience and which are discussing from a broad field of humanities, in sociology, in politology, philosophy of course, and other fields like applied ethics and so on. This time I invite my guest Alessandro Pinzani from Brazil and Marek Hrubec from Philosophical Institute. So enjoy this meeting and perhaps you can think about the open questions. So we will start. So dear colleagues, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me open the international issue of the Philosophical Café 2019. The Philosophical Café is an event which I organize every month. It means every first week in the month, in the Thursday from 4 p.m. The gatherings are taking place here in the Philosophical Institute in the basement. It means in the Jazz Club, Jazz Republic, and I'm discussing with my guests many issues which concerning the broad topic of the European tradition, and many questions they are interesting for the broad audience, from the public space, and from many perspectives. It means in humanities, sociology, politology, psychology, applied ethics, for example, science, philosophy, and so on. My topic of research is ancient Greece, a European tradition, and also, well, let's say the German tradition of the classical German philosophy and the birth of classical philology in Germany in 18th and 19th century. So the core of the Philosophical Café is connected with the question of Europe, European tradition, European concept of human being, and I am very proud to have the honor to introduce my guests today. On the first place, Alessandro Pinzani from Brazil, Santa Catarina, who is invited also to do research here in Czech Republic in Academy of Science, and Marek Hrubec from our Philosophical Institute. So first Marek will introduce the work and research of Alessandro, then Alessandro will have a talk about his recent research, and then we'll start discussing these topics also with you. You are also, of course, invited to join the discussion. So please, Marek, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm glad that I was invited by Kryštof because as a head of the Center of Global Studies, where Professor Alessandro Pinzani is a guest professor, I'm very glad that he's here with us and that we can make research together. And I'm also glad that he accepted the invitation to give a talk here in Philosophical Café and answer questions. And I was invited to raise some questions after his talk, and together with Kryštof to open a discussion after his presentation. Professor Alessandro Pinzani is originally from Federal University of Santa Catarina in Florianopolis, South Brazil. Originally he's from Florence, from Italy. He studied in Tübingen in Germany, where he got his PhD, and then he worked there later and got his habilitation in philosophy. He was a visiting researcher at various universities in the world, not only in Europe but also in the United States, at Columbia University in New York, for example, in Humboldt University in Berlin. Also, he got Alexander Humboldt Foundation scholarship, and he was visiting also at other universities in Germany, for example in Dresden or in Bochum, and also he cooperates with various universities in Brazil, so he spent some time also in PUC University in Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul in south of Brazil. He's focusing on ethics and social and political philosophy. He is well known in countries of European Union, North America, South America, and other places as well. I would mention his last book, which he published together with his Brazilian colleague. The book is called Money, Autonomy and Citizenship. It appeared last year in Springer Publishing House in Germany in the English language, and previously it was published in Brazilian Portuguese in Brazil. Today his lecture will focus on some selected topics of that book in order to stress moral, ethical and social philosophical aspects of that book. I think that he will tell you more. He promised to give about a 20-minute presentation. So thank you for coming and accepting, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marek. Thank you, Kryštof, for the invitation. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry I don't speak Czech, so I will speak in English. I know it is lingua franca nowadays, but actually being in the Czech Republic, I should be able to speak Czech. Maybe next year, or maybe in a couple of years, I will be able to hold this a conference in Czech. So, as Marek said, I would like to discuss with you some aspect of this book, just to tell you what the book is about. The book is partly a sociological research. The colleague who wrote it with me, Valkyria Leon-Hego, is a sociologist. And part is a philosophical book. We try to investigate the consequences on the subjectivity of people who receive a social program called Bolsa Familia. So in this context, I was asked to elaborate a concept of autonomy that might be workable also for a sociological research. And in doing so, I realized that the usual concept of autonomy with which we work in ethics, so in moral or social philosophy, has sometimes a problem. And who called my attention to this aspect was Georg Simmel, the German philosopher and sociologist, who in 1900 published a book called Philosophy of Money. And Simmel, in this book, claimed that individual autonomy is a specific modern phenomenon. This is a thesis that has been defended also by many other authors, is still quite popular. So I'm sorry for Kryštof, no individual autonomy among the Greeks according to these readings. But why he say it is a specific modern phenomenon? Because according to him, it is linked to the appearance of a mercantilist system. Basically, according to Simmel, in pre-modern societies, people have duties which are characterized by personal ties. The paradigmatic case is the liege lord and his subjects. So people are imprisoned in a network of relations and personal commitments that leave them practically no freedom. In mercantilistic society, as well in the capitalistic society that follow mercantilism, these duties are depersonalized. So instead of owning hours of free labor to the liege lord, the so-called corvées, the subject just pay taxes. Thus, the relationship becomes less personal. So the liege lords appear not like the real people they are, but as impersonal entities to which one owes certain taxes. So according to Simmel, this makes people more independent from one another, to the point that their natural interdependence, which of course still exists, is linked not to a network of unescapable personal relations, but to a network of impersonal relations. So individuals offer to each other just one side of themselves. They are client, they are competitors, they are suppliers, etc. And their reciprocal relationship is now based basically on money. So they pay each other for certain services, and by way of money, they buy their independence from any other personal commitment or of time. So it is worth pointing out that for Simmel, independence or freedom is not a characteristic of the individual, a quality of the individual, like, say, physical strength or intelligence. Rather, independence or freedom depend on relationships that this person establishes with others. So I will quote shortly Simmel: individual freedom is not a pure inner condition of an isolated subject, but rather a phenomenon of correlation which loses its meanings when its opposite is absent, end of quote. In other words, individual freedom has always, according to Simmel, an intersubjective character. It is always social freedom, so to use Axel Honneth's term. Now, according to Simmel, this material independence granted by money is an essential component of individual freedom. So for Simmel, monetary income has historically, so he thinks that this is really an historical phenomenon that he is describing, monetary income has turned people into determined individuals. But at the same time, this has some paradoxical character. So for example, at the same time in which income, monetary income, allows for the depersonalization of these ties with other individuals, simultaneously, and is simultaneously to individualization, at the same time in which this happens, so at the same time in which an individual becomes more independent, he becomes less free from another point of view. So if he gains independence from the personal relation to the liege lords, at the same time he becomes dependent from the necessity of having a regular monetary income. So according to Simmel, therefore, this process, in this historical process, for him it is an historical process, through which individuals become more autonomous, doesn't mean that this autonomy that they gain is absolute or perfect. As a matter of fact, according to him, individual freedom is never absolute, so it is always tied to some conditions. In this case, the conditionality is having a source of monetary income, and it is never perfect. So it is always, one is always autonomous up to a certain point. So it's a matter of degree. Now, this was, again, the starting point of our consideration on the autonomy. And what I find fascinating is that actually these remarks by Simmel on the relation between monetary income and individual autonomy as something which is characteristic of modernity had been already formulated many times by different authors. So the idea that in modernity we can decide ourselves who we want to be and how we want to live, what Hartmut Rosa called the promise of autonomy, which characterized modernity, It is something that you can find in different authors. So I would like to pick up two of these authors very briefly, very shortly. These two authors are Adam Smith and Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. Just to show you that this idea by Simmel, which might strike us as a little bit far-fetched, connecting money and individual autonomy, actually is something you can find in two very classical modern philosophers. And when I say modern philosophers, I'm not referring just to the fact that they live in modernity, but that they think modernity. So they really are aware that the period of time in which they are living is a different time. And they both see this difference in individual freedom, although they define it differently. So I would like first to start with Adam Smith. I will start with a very famous claim by Smith. I think everyone knows this passage. Nevertheless, I'm quoting it. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our non-necessities, but of their advantages. So, end of quote. These words anticipated and probably inspired Simmel's analysis, but they have a different focus. Namely, Smith insists on self-interest as the motor of society and as a decisive aspect of individuality. So what drives individuals is not just a strive for freedom, but for material self-interest. The desire, as Smith say, to better their situation through an increase in monetary income. Put it in another way, Smith appears to highlight a relevant factor of the concept of individual autonomy that Simmel will not discuss later. Namely, autonomy can be owned in different degrees according to the level of income that you have. So the poorer you are, the less autonomous you are, according to Smith. So money allows better in one situation, and interestingly, not only materially, but also immaterially. I will quote another famous passage by Smith. In the present times, to the greater part of Europe, a creditable day laborer will be ashamed to appear in public without a linen shirt. So Smith establishes a connection between the lack of monetary resources and shame. That is, between the material and the immaterial aspects of one's economic situations. So according to Smith, individual freedom involves both aspects. It concerns the capacity of doing things because one has the material resources needed for it, but also because one has the mental and psychological ability needed for it. So one, for instance, is not ashamed to go out without a linen shirt. So being autonomous for Smith implies disposing on both the material and the immaterial conditions that are necessary to act according to one's plans. And the immaterial conditions on their part depends on having the material, the access to material resources. So already Smith established a relation between monetary income and autonomy, and different level of autonomy. So this leads to a point which is discussed now by Simmel, but left underdetermined by Smith, namely the interdependence that individuals have to each other. As we see also in Smith, you have this idea that individuals need others to satisfy their necessities, but he sees this independency in a very detached way. So I pay money and I get what I need. So there is an author who makes stronger this relation of interdependence, and this author is Hegel. In his philosophy of right, Hegel criticized Smith and other liberal authors like Locke, but namely he referred to Smith, because these authors define freedom as an underdetermined capacity of acting according to one's choice. According to Hegel, this idea is wrong. So, according to Hegel, the space of individual freedom is defined by the social context in which individuals happen to live and act. So, far from being an abstract capacity to act, freedom indicates always a set of concrete possibilities that individuals face in their everyday life. So while liberals in Hegel's reading see, for instance, moral and legal duties as limits to individual freedom, Hegel sees in them the tools that allow defining concretely freedom. In other words, one is never abstractly an agent. One is always a socially defined subject, a spouse, a parent, a child, an economic partner, a citizen, etc. Every role is defined by the corresponding duties and rights that define precisely the space of freedom assigned to every member of society. So from this point of view, individuals are as autonomous as the social conditions allow for. And under this condition, Hegel means the historical moment in which this specific society is living, so the level of technological progress or economic, legal, and moral development, or its dominant beliefs and values, its social practices, etc. But more interestingly for us, one necessary condition to be free, according to Hegel, is being inserted into the economic system of society. So in what Hegel called, as you probably know, the system of needs. Participating in the economic system is a necessary condition for producing goods and service that individuals need for satisfying their needs. But it is also a necessary condition to participate into the production of that social wealth of which individuals secure their share. So without this economic independence, without this economic autonomy, individuals fall out of society and can become a part of what Hegel called Pöbel, which is normally translated as mob, which is maybe not the right wording, but I will use it. What characterizes mob is not only the lack of material resources, once again, but the fact that they go through this exclusion from society to a moral downfall or an ethical downfall, and therefore they refuse to respect the norms of that society. So being a part of the mob, according to Hegel, is not just being poor in material sense, it means also to lack the ethical condition to be really free. So as you can see, this idea that by Simmel, that Simmel formulated in 1900, are already present in two paradigmatical interpreters of modernity. So what do we do with these ideas? Are these ideas workable? Is this, because if you take these three authors, we have seen they have different focuses. They stress or they highlight different aspects, but basically they all agree in establishing a connection, a direct connection between having access to monetary income and developing a certain level of autonomy or individual freedom. So, what do we do with this idea? Is this a still workable idea, and why could it be interesting for us? Well, I think it is interesting because if you look at the way in which normally contemporary moral and political philosophy use this concept of individual autonomy or individual freedom, I'm using them till now, as you can see, like the same concept. Of course they are not. We will discuss this. The way in which they use it doesn't take into account this aspect. So in the literature we have the impression that autonomy is just a quality that the individual has, precisely like its personal strength. So it is not seen as an intersubjective dimension. It is not seen as something that individuals gain in their relation to others. It is not seen something that depends, most of all, from this material condition. So I think that it would be interesting to reivindicate this idea expressed by Simmel, Smith, and Hegel in different levels, and try to elaborate a concept of autonomy that take into account all these dimensions. So, in the rest of the last 10 minutes, or even less of my presentation, I will focus on an author which, in my view, can help us to build a concept of individual autonomy that takes into account precisely this dimension. And his author is Amartya Sen. So, and I'm referring specifically to his capability approach. What is this capability approach? Well, first of all, I would like to stress an aspect. Amartya Sen theory is not in itself an ethical or a moral theory. It is just a theory of action. So when Sen introduced concepts like functioning or capabilities, he's just trying to offer us concepts that allow us to describe what happens when individuals act. So there is no normative dimension in this aspect in itself. Of course, starting from this theory, you can elaborate a normative theory. But for now, I will just refer to this non-normative and descriptive aspect. So, first concept we have to take into account when thinking of Sen is the concept of functioning. What is a functioning? Well, Sen example is riding a bicycle. So riding a bicycle requires, of course, engaging in a specific activity by way of a tool, in this case, the bike. The interesting question, according to Sen, is what leads an individual to this function. So you can have two individuals who ride a bike, but for very different reasons. So they might do so because they don't want to use a car, because of ecological awareness or to avoid traffic, or because they don't have a car. And in this case, in the latter case, they can ride a bicycle because there is no system of public transport, or because the system is insufficient, or because they don't have enough money to pay the ticket. So, to give the example given by Sen, you may have a rich executive who rides by bike to his factory, and then you can have a worker, a poor worker of the same factory, also riding to the same place. But they do it for very different reasons and under very different circumstances. So the fact that they share a functioning, riding a bicycle, doesn't say us very much about what their freedom really is. So Sen, interesting, introduced this concept of freedom of functioning. So he will say, the rich executive has more freedom, has a greater freedom than the worker, because he can choose among a wider range of functionings. So he could ride a bike, he could drive a car, he could take a bus, he could take an helicopter, as Brazilian executives do, for instance, while the worker has no other choice but ride a bicycle. So even if they share functioning, they don't share the same range of options. So first, Sen tells us that when we talk about freedom, we should first think of what kind of freedom are we talking about. Freedom of function is then defined as the freedom of having to choose among different options. Now, functionings can be achieved, according to Sen, because we dispose of a certain set of conditions that he calls capabilities. What are capabilities? They are not individual capacities, and they cannot be seen as isolated abilities. One has always a set of capabilities that permits to set out a certain set of functions. So let's imagine a case. A poor woman living in a poor region in the interior, say, of Brazil, in a very patriarchal family. Yeah? And then she decides to move and to go to a big city to look for a better life. So, in order to do this, in order to have this functioning, moving to a different city, she needs capabilities. What are these capabilities? Of course, first, these capabilities can be seen as internal qualities of this woman. Does she has the physical, psychological, mental strength to do this? Can she really tear herself apart from her family, from the place where she is born? from this culture whose language and values she shares. But according to Sam, there are other aspects we should take into account. First, material aspect connected to her individually, that she has the money to move to another city, but also external social condition. From the most trivial one, like, is there a public transport to this other city? Can she physically move to this other city? But also more broader conditions. What would she do in this city? Does she has the qualification that allow her to enter the labor market in the city? What kind of qualification are demanded in that society? Are there jobs in that society that pay living wage for her? Does she has what I would call now epistemic autonomy? We can discuss this later in the debate. That allows her to assert herself as an individual in this city, or will she be considered in this city as a citizen of second league, so to say, who is not properly a right peer, who doesn't deserve the same rights that other individuals deserve? So when we ask ourselves, is this woman free to move to the city, we should answer to all these questions. So we should ask ourselves, does the woman have the capabilities that may translate into the functioning of moving to a different city? And once again, the answer is very much connected to the fact that this woman has the monetary income that will allow her to make this move. It's also one of the main sources for creating capabilities, according to Sam, is money. Money can translate into capabilities. So in order to have a greater freedom of functioning, you have to have to dispose of a greater set of capabilities. But in order to have a greater set of capabilities, you have to have access to the resource of money, which then will be translated into a set of capabilities. Well, of course, money is not the only source for creating capabilities. There are many others, but I would like to stress this aspect because I think it is in this point that using sense capability approach to try to understand how individuals gain freedom and how now this freedom can be seen in a much more complex and intersubjective way than in the tradition. So I think that it is interesting to see how in this point Amartya Sen connect to Georg Simmel, who on his part connected to Smith and Hegel. So that if we want really to say that individual freedom is a characteristic of the modern individual, this claim should come with a proviso, namely, provided that these individuals has access to source of monetary income. Otherwise, his individual autonomy will be severely impaired. So this was basically the concept of autonomy that was the starting point for developing a concept of autonomy that we use then in the book, which is very much sociologically defined. So I'm not going to enter on this. What I would like to discuss with you is this question: how do monetary income relate to individual autonomy, and how does this lead us to an intersubjective concept of individual autonomy? So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Perhaps let me start with the first question. So, if you are speaking about this concept of autonomy, so then one could ask if you are not speaking about some theoretical construct of some individual which doesn't have any typical sides like or characteristic like I don't know, some human being living in Europe or in Brazil, for example, or I don't know, gender characteristics or characteristics of age, and so on, because there are big differences between people that are educated in universities or educated in the high schools, or even uneducated, illiterate, as you say. So there are quite great differences, and you are speaking very, let's say, universally about some individual. So, is it possible to take it so universally and make connections between, for example, the concrete, the situation in Brazil? Because the most cases, the most situations you describe in this book is from Brazil, is taken from Brazil. Is it relevant, for example, for European Union? Isn't it too universal and too broad to be useful for the situation in the society and in the politics now?
I answer. Well, no, thank you for the question. This was precisely one of the points that, in a sense, engage us more. Because again, if you take the usual literature, you will find a reference to individuals. In feminist theory, at least, there is an awareness that you can just talk about individuals, that gender, for instance, play a role. And of course, gender played a role also in our investigation, because we interviewed women, not men. So of course, there was this aspect. So what was we tried to come to was precisely a definition of autonomy in which individuals are taken not just as this abstraction, without gender, without history, without society, but are always inserted in their specific society. So that's why the reference to Hegel too. The women we interview in our book, for instance, they define themselves, their autonomy. They didn't use this concept. Well, they used the concept of freedom in terms of duties. So they said, thanks to this social program, I am more free as a mother because I have more money to take care of my children. So they didn't see the existence of specific duties, in this case, maternal duties, as a limit to the freedom. On the contrary, they define their, let's say, view of what an autonomous life is in terms of the duties, in terms of the social, position. So I would say, thanks to Zen more than Simmel. Simmel, as a matter of fact, has this very modern, abstract concept of autonomy. But Zen, following Hegel, I would say, allows us, thanks to the idea of capabilities, to have a different concept of autonomy. Because, again, it is not that you have a subject, an abstract subject, which has or doesn't have autonomy. The idea is you have an individual now, as in the biological sense, if you want, so the representative of the species Homo sapiens sapiens, and these individuals will have more or less choice of functioning according to capabilities. And of course, when you start looking how these individuals develop capabilities, all these methods that you mentioned, age, gender, literacy, the kind of society in which this person is living will come into place. But precisely in order to take all this into account, I have to have a concept of autonomy, which is not the abstract idea of autonomy like what Hegel criticized, this undetermined capacity of acting according to one's choice. So that's why we tried to go back to Hegel and then to Sen, contemporary, precisely because you could then describe the individual as something different. But at the same time, I would say, of course, you can't make this kind of abstraction, but up to a certain point, you even can do it. I mean, it depends very much how you define autonomy. So you can, of course, start by defining autonomy as simply the capacity to act. But then this is really a very abstract concept. I would say non-human animals have this capacity. Interesting, it's when you start introducing some other aspects, like for instance, the capacity to taking responsibility for your action and for giving reason for your action, what normally is called agency. But this is still very abstract. Because of course, what does it mean, taking responsibility? In which context? In which social context? Who is demanding justification for this action? So that's why you know, if you remain with this very abstract concept, you don't come much farther. So I agree with you at this point.
I have a question for you too. In fact, two questions. One related to the history of philosophy, and the second related to philosophy, the contemporary philosophy. So first, as for the history of philosophy, when you interpreted Adam Smith, and you showed his interpretation of autonomy as it is related to monetary income and not so much to some social groups as it was previously, but in modernity it's much more related, of course, dominantly related to money. I would like to ask you if you would agree that this kind of interpretation is in fact, it has two aspects. First, it's a kind of reification, because he didn't analyze new modern relations between human beings too much when he said that autonomy is so dependent on money, on monetary income. So it's a kind of reification of intersubject relations. And he didn't look behind that reification, and he didn't identify dependence of one's autonomy on specific social groups. So he analyzed only mediation, only money.
Yeah.
And the second aspect is, yeah, we know that the modern world is really more run by money. So it's correct, this kind of description is true from a perspective of seeing that alienated world. So in a way, it's valid, because people really feel alienated and they see their relation to money and not to other people behind that. But in a way, a proper, correct, deeper interpretation would see those relations beyond money. So it's a kind of reification in reality, but it's not only a reification in reality, but also it's a reification which Adam Smith confirms or legitimizes. And second, concerning the contemporary situation, from the point of view of economic and political philosophy, let's say, even if we know that officially a principle of merit or meritocracy is presented as the main principle for allocation of, let's say, allocation not only goods, but allocation of appreciation, recognition of persons, and so on. In reality, let's say, ever-increasing tendency to, you can say, Brazilization in this way, the big social inequalities lead to the situation which is described by some, like Ulrich Beck, for example, as a kind of refeudalization. Because people are more dependent again on their social status than on their merit, because they can work as much as they want, but still they would get 1,000 or 10,000 times less money because of their status, because of their social status. So is it a backlash, in fact, in modernity, that we are going back to the pre-monetary dependencies in this sense?
Thank you very much. I think I will answer them both questions together in a sense. So your question forced me to make the step that I didn't make in the presentation, namely from the explanatory moment in which following Simmel and Sen mostly, I try to understand how autonomy works to the normative aspect. So okay, we agree, let's say, on the diagnosis that there is a direct connection between money and freedom, let's say, to put it shortly, yeah? The point is this a good thing or not? And what does this say about society and also about the freedom that we have in society? So this will be the normative aspect. And then, if you want to see, if you see it more critically, you may have to, let's say, at least two different perspectives. The first one would be, I would call it the moral criticism. And it has very much to do with your last question. Like, well, okay, modernity is characterized by the fact that you are free because you have enough money not to depend from others. You don't depend from the will of others because through money you are capable to satisfy your needs without recurring to their benevolence and so on and so on. The point is precisely, how is this money allocated? And then, if I can show that the mechanism for allocation of monetary income is, let's say, how can I say, biased or distorted by other kind of relations which are supposed not to be there, which are pre-modern, so family ties. Then I will have a sort of moral criticism of this mechanism. In which sense? In the sense that I could say that the mechanism is then unfair or unjust. So I will have an unfair or unjust distribution of income and of social positions. So this is a possible strategy that you can follow. Many political theories of social justice do this.
I meant it more descriptively, in fact.
Yeah.
More descriptive philosophy.
Yes, I know, but you can use this description, just for making this kind of criticism. But what would be maybe more interesting for me would be what I would call the ethical criticism, in which it is not that you criticize the mechanisms of allocation of income and therefore of social position, therefore also of freedom, because they are unfair or unjust or distorted or biased, but you criticize the very fact that in order to be free, you need monetary income. So this would be the kind of criticism in which you don't just criticize the mechanism for, let's say, creating freedom, but the fact that this freedom has this price, so to say, is attained only by through the means of money. So it refers, and this refers to your first question. Of course, money is just a tool, but the reification is here not just plain fetishism. So it is not like I'm referring now to Marx's idea of fetishism, like okay, money is just. If you focus on money, you are just focusing on the fetish, you are not seeing the social relations which are behind. No, I'm saying that money is not just a tool, it becomes in itself the way in which social relations are established. So it is not just a matter of fetishism, it's really a matter of reification in a real sense of the word. So social relationships are really monetary relationships. And this allows for elaborating an ethical criticism of society. So not just saying, the allocation of money is unjust or unfair. The very fact that in order to be free, you need money is in itself a form of, let's call it, bad life, for lack of adjective. So I'm using bad because it is the easiest adjective. Yeah? So from this point of view, I really would go a step further and say it is not just about the fact that you focus on the mean, actually you realize that the mean is only what is there. That social relationship has been transformed into monetary relationship. So it is not that money is hiding something which is behind. What was behind is now transformed into monetary relation.
Still, it's something. There are some social groups.
Yes.
Behind that.
Yes, of course. But the point is, their relations can be seen purely in monetary terms. So there is, of course, I'm not now defending this position, but I think this is an interesting line of thought. So if you are, let's say, an orthodox Marxist, you should follow this line. If you are a Bourdieu kind of critic, then you would rather describe these social groups according to categories which are not monetary. And then, of course, you will have a different kind of ethical criticism. But what I wanted to stress is the options that this way of seeing the relation between money and freedom open up for social criticism. But I'm not committing to any of this form of criticism, not yet.
Maybe we can open a discussion with others, and then we can add some questions as well during the
if there is
process of discussion.
Some question now, so of course you can join. If someone wants to ask, so
well, I think I will have a couple of questions, but now it is rather in form of remarks. So hopefully I will start with them, and then hopefully I will proceed to some questions. And I would be interested in Simmel's conception of autonomy. I'd like to know if he somehow dealt with Marx and Marx's theory especially, because it seems to me, and this relates to your conception as well, that maybe it's already in Hegel, I don't know, because I'm not quite well aware of it, but it seems to me that Marx actually added certain attributes which seems to me quite important, and this is the antagonistic relationship between certain groups within society. And it seems to me that, of course, autonomy is a relative concept, but maybe what Marx can tell us is that the autonomy of one group is actually based on non-autonomy of other group, right? Mm-hmm. So this would be like maybe a first question. Do you see some limitation? Is there a limit within your conception as well? Then I'm not sure if, I mean, just to take some experiences from everyday life, if you say that autonomy is strictly based on monetary income, then I would think of, I don't know, some top managers or other people who are so self-disciplined that they at least feel to be not really autonomous, but more as a, I don't know, people who are simply deprived of autonomy, right? You work all day long, in the end you come to see a therapist because you can't work anymore and so on. So this seems to me, again, as a part of maybe critique of your conception, maybe it is too narrow. And then from, I would be interested in the concept of resistance, how it actually relates to your conception of autonomy. Because maybe, again, I mean, this is maybe extreme example, but if you take a look on concentration camps, right, Nazis concentration camps, you have Jews quite well established within society, I mean before, people who had definitely greater monetary income than the Roma, for example, but it was the Roma who actually organized uprising within concentration camps, not Jews. Mostly, at least as far as I know, maybe I'm completely wrong. But this would be, maybe this could be a basis for other criticism of your conception, that it's not perhaps monetary income predominantly that determines our capacity to resistance, but again to act freely. I think it's enough. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I will start maybe with the last question. Well, of course, claiming that there is a relation between monetary income and developing a certain level of autonomy doesn't mean necessarily to say that the only condition for being autonomous is having money. Of course, there might be situations in which having money in itself is not enough. Like, for instance, the case that you mentioned. You know, being a rich Jew, let's say, or even a rich homosexual, or or a rich communist, of course, there weren't many. During the Nazi time, it doesn't give you maybe the kind of autonomy that allow you to escape from the concentration camp. But these are, I would say, very extraordinary situations.
But if I can step it in,
Yeah.
it's also very interesting that especially in the case of Jews, the situation was so that before they were sent to concentration camps, they were deprived from their wealth.
Yes.
So firstly, they were deprived from the money
Yeah.
and from the old wealth. So in the situation they were sent to the concentration camp, it was the last step. But in the first prize, they were deprived from the positions in the society. So, for example, lawyers, they are not able to work as lawyers, or, for example, doctors, physicians, they are not able to do their work, or, of course, not the people they are working with financial sources. Also, everything was stopped. They were forced to live as hand workers and so on. And in the last situation, they were deprived from the money and all these. Then was the autonomy was away. So
no, you're right. It was always a step-by-step process. It wasn't just you got taken.
And money was first, of course.
Money was first. The prohibition of exerts in the profession, not only the liberal profession, but something every kind of profession. And then again, if you can't have a work, if you can't work, how do you survive in a society in which, without money, you really can't, literally, you can't have access to the satisfier for your basic needs. You depend then on the goodwill of others, on the beneficence of others. So from this point of view, I would still agree, but then again, this is the first step. Then of course there are other steps. For instance, also this, what I called before the epistemic autonomy. That is the capacity of asserting yourself and saying who you are, rejecting sometimes the definition that comes from the outside, but then, okay, so I think this could answer your doubt in the third doubt. Then the first one about Marx. Yes, Marx of course has a much stronger view, let's say, than Simmel on this point. At the same time, I'm not sure whether you need to accept or to feel committed to the strong version of this intersubjective dimension of autonomy, which is the one that Marx gave, in order to say that autonomy is has an intersubjective nature and depends from the social conditions. So let's say this kind of definition that I gave include also a Marxian view. The Marxian view would be, so to say, a restriction of this more general vision. And what is the problem with the Marxian vision? That you have to accept really that the autonomy of a group is based on the loss of autonomy of another group, which is a very strong thesis, which might be true historically in certain moments, but it's difficult to be maintained as a general thesis for every kind of society. So, on the other side, if you have this, let's call it pseudo-Hegelian Hegelian-inspired view of freedom as intersubjective phenomenon, you might have this situation described by Marx, but you may have also a more, let's say, a situation in which there is a win-win, so to say. I mean, different groups gain more autonomy. Of course, even if you take the process described by Simmel, you could say, well, the liege lords are losing their privilege more than their autonomy, because now the subjects just pay money on the one side. On the other side, that frees them also from certain duties of protection towards the subject. So this moment of liberation, which marks the passage from feudalism to modernity, according to Simmel, would be a win-win situation. We can discuss whether this is the case, and of course it is always difficult when philosophers do this kind of generalization. It's very difficult, to say what happened when you go from feudalism to modernity. This is really a big generalization. This is what philosophers tended to do nowadays, less and less. We are more self-conscious about this. We say, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this kind of generalization, but Simmel lives still in an epoch in which this is normal. And in his view, for instance, you don't have to follow Marx on the very strict view of how social groups relate to each other. And I would rather be sympathetic to this reading, not because I think Marx is wrong, but because it allows for describing different societies in different historical moments. And then, sorry, the second question was?
It was about top managers and marginalized groups and the concept of resistance.
Yes, no, the top manager, yeah, right. Yes, well, I think I concede to your objection. I would say this objection, in any case, reach Sen, because Sen would just say, well, manager has in any case more freedom of functioning. If they don't want to make use of this, if they want to live ascetically, that's their problem. But they have more freedom than, say, a poor person who lives ascetically because it has no other choice. On the other side, I would also say, well, this is the typical liberal view according to which individuals are free in this sense of choice. I, the manager, freely decide to live like this. We know that things are not so easy. So from this point of view, this is the moment in which I would disagree with Sen and go more towards this idea that autonomy is defined intersubjectively and socially, and that means also, that includes also the kind of pressure that can come on you depending on your social role. So if you live in a society like ours, where competition is considered to be something very positive, there is a strong pressure on certain role, let's say manager, to live a certain kind of life, to sacrifice, for instance, specific aspect of their life, and to live according to specific ideals. So from this point of view, you could say, look, the manager is not free to decide whether he wants to live or she wants to live ascetically. Actually, this person is just reacting to pressure coming out from society. But also in this case, you will see that, once again, autonomy is something that you have on different level according to social conditions. So it is not a quality of the individuals. It depends on this kind of balance or imbalance that you have between what an individual plans to do with his or her life on the one side, and what society allows these individuals to do. And that was precisely Hegel's point. Hegel say, individuals tend to see their life as the result of their free choice, but it's not. It is the result of the social condition, and the space of freedom is really defined by the possibility that they have within that society, and it means also within the pressure that society exerts on them. From this point of view, Marx is very clear when he says it it is not that the proletarians, for instance, are the only victim of capitalism. The capitalist is also victim of capitalism. But from another point of view, he is also the winner. So of course he is suffering because he has to obey to the logic of capitalism. If, for instance, he has to obey to the logic of the valuation of capital and so on, of competition. So he is also under distress. But of course he is in a better position than the proletarian. Or to put it in a Senian language, he has more freedom of functioning. But again, this is also an abstract freedom because, yes, okay, he could do differently in the sense that he has this option. But does he really have this option? Does he have the capabilities? So you could go force a little bit what Sen say and say, well, among the capabilities are also the social pressure connected to the social role. Sen doesn't see it like this. He's very liberal. But you could try to make of Sen and Hegelian and say, no, no, of course, this counts also as a capability. Maybe this could be a way to answer your very, very, very good objection.
But Professor Pinzani speaks exactly about this point in his book.
Yes.
So it's mentioned there. Yes, it's mentioned there. Perhaps the point is that the nowadays society is much more complicated than in the times of Adam Smith, for example. Yeah. So there is no free, no laissez-faire at all. So not free market in the theoretical sense. Now the society is globalized and too complicated to see the autonomy in so simple way like in the Smith time. So
maybe also in Smith time were complicated, I would say, but probably he didn't.
Yes,
he couldn't see this. I mean, also at his time, the economy was globalized, but of course he lacked the capacity. Yes, or let's say internationalized. But of course he lacked this analytical capacity, not because he was limited in his intellectual faculty, because it was too near in a temporary sense, meaning to what was going on. To make a comparison, it's like with Machiavelli and modern state. Machiavelli sees the rise of modern state, he describes it, but he doesn't have the concept for the modern state. So that's why he lacks a theory of state. And the same is with Smith. Smith sees that what is going on. He sees these forces that the market economy is, let's say, unchaining, but not in its concept, not in their consequences. So what he describes is really a partial view, a very stylized view of what really market economy is, and therefore very partial. And that's why some people say Smith is being ideological. Well, I don't know whether it is being ideological. He's being partial. It's just saying a part of it, which is also what Hegel says of the liberals. It doesn't say they are wrong. He says, well, they're just looking at a part of reality, a small portion of reality. Reality is bigger, so to say, than what they see. So I would say...
But perhaps the point is that it is not the word of everyone. It's the word only of citizens and of agents of the market, which in Smith's time, these were, for example, not women at all.
No,
so,
in this sense,
so these are only very small group, which brings me back to the ancient Greece and to the question of citizenship, because your book is also on citizenship, and you were not talking about citizenship at all today.
Wow.
So,
20 minutes.
Yeah, I understand, but. Which relationships are between autonomy and citizenship? Because in ancient times, autonomy was defined by the citizenship, by the laws given by the group. So
yeah, but it was a different kind of autonomy.
Yeah, of course.
That's why it was a common. I mean, this is also a very Hegelian theme. Now, when Hegel say, you know, the individual, the free subject in ancient time is the community. It's not the individual. While nowadays, when we talk about citizenship, we talk about something which is considered to be an individual quality, not, you know, citizenship as the set of citizens. Well, in the book we try to make this connection because, of course, if autonomy has an intersubjective, a social character, it has also unavoidably a political character, because there is a strong connection between the way in which a society is structured and organized, therefore the possibilities that the societies give to its members in order to be autonomous, more or less autonomous on the one side, and the way the society is politically structured, and the kind of policies that these political societies follow. So coming back to a question that arises in your first point, in the first intervention that I didn't touch, does it, I mean, what we write about Brazil, does it apply also to Europe? This is precisely one of the points in which you can see the difference. Most European societies tend to have a vision of themselves as political entities, and therefore of what does it mean to be a citizen, which is very different from the way in which Brazilian society see itself as a political society and therefore define what does it mean to be a citizen. So for instance, being a citizen in most European societies mean that you have specific rights, and among these rights are also social rights. So we have the idea that if you, it doesn't matter for which reason, if for some reason you are not able to provide for yourself the means to satisfy your basic needs, society is going to help you. And then you have, of course, different kind of answers to this issue. So we will have, and this is the, there is a whole tradition in political science about this, different definition of welfare state. So we'll have, the strong welfare state in which the state really help you directly with social policies, and then you have the more liberal view in which the state just, help you to find a way back into economic independence. So you will have different answers and different social institutions which are supposed to help you. But in any case, there is the idea that every member of society is a citizen, has this right, and must be somehow helped by society. Now you have, for instance, Brazil, and because of Brazilian history, based on slavery, based on for many hundreds of years, on a strictly hierarchical view of society, in which you have a small number of people who consider themselves to be rights bearer. Actually, they have privilege, but they consider this to be right. And then you have the vast majority of the population, which is completely who lack completely any rights. Because of this history of this hierarchical view, till now Brazilian society doesn't see itself as a political community of equal members, and doesn't see things that being a citizen mean having this kind of rights. So in Brazil, if you are poor, that's your problem. This is why the first real social policies aimed at eradicating poverty were taken under the Lula government, 2002. That means more than 500 years after the foundation of Brazil. So for 500 years, they knew that they were poor, but there were never specific policies to help the poor. There might have been policies to help workers, to give them specific rights, but not to help the poor. And the poor are a big number. I mean, the severe poor in Brazil are 25% of the population. The severe poor. The poor, let's more or less the half. Depends how you count them. Yeah.
But some workers are also poor.
Sorry?
some workers are also poor.
Of course.
So it's
Yes, I
not
mean,
either
there is this
or,
kind of
but
poverty.
it's-
There is a, precisely, yes, you're right.
it's
So,
part of it.
or most people, I would say many people in Brazil, not only in Brazil, in many countries, the US is also very, and also a country in which being a citizen doesn't mean having social rights. Many people live not necessarily under the line of poverty, but slightly above, or mostly they go up and down. So they will find a job, but then they will lose it, or they will find a job which is not enough to earn a living wage, so they can't make ends meet. So there is always this oscillation. So European societies tend to have a vision of what it means to be a political community and what it means to be a citizen, according to which these people will be helped. Societies like Brazil don't. And this has to do, once again, with what Hegel said. To be free, I mean, you are free as far as your society allows you to be free. So let's say if you are a poor person, you are more free, say, in Norway than in Brazil. And not because, you have different legal status. From the point of view of the constitution, also in Brazil, people have the same rights. Then the poor has the same rights as the rich. But if you look at the reality, at the concrete reality, you will see the differences. And these differences are really connected to the kind of social conditions, not only political, that you find in your society. What does it mean to be a member of the Brazilian society? What does it mean to be a member of the Norwegian society?
So even money.
Yes. Basically, again, we come back to this. I mean, what do social policies mostly... well, of course, money is not the only resource which is distributed through social policies. But even if when it is not directly money, like in this program that we studied, in this case it's really money. But in any case, social policies depend, of course, on money. How much money the state is going to spend in this social policy or in these services. How much money does the Czech state spend for a healthcare system? So, of course, there is also a monetary question at the end of the day. So, in our case, the point was that this woman some of them at least, start seeing themselves as citizens precisely because suddenly the state is doing something for them. So it's like, this new subject appears, but as we say in the book, this is not enough. But this is a very sociological aspect. But from the philosophical point of view, once again, it's very difficult to talk about citizens if you don't have a clear definition of what does it mean to be a citizen. And of course, you can give a very beautiful, normatively strong definition of citizen, but then when you look at reality, things are different.
I will go back to social philosophy and raise the question on the key term, autonomy.
Yeah.
You follow neo-Hegelian interpretations and develop them. So you try to show that the concept autonomy should not be defined individually, but more intersubjectively. I think it is good if you relate the concept of autonomy to collective entities, to plural, to persons in plural. But my question is, does it really work if you relate autonomy to an individual? I think, isn't it a contradiction? Because the concept of autonomy itself is individualistic. If you say autonomos, it means he or she gives nomos, laws, to herself or himself. But that's exactly what you do not want from neo-Hegelian point of view or neo-Aristotelian. What you want is not just to redefine individualistic concept of autonomy intersubjectively. I think that the basis of that concept of autonomy is individualistic, So, in fact, what you want to do if you would really radicalize your requirement would be to redefine autonomy you would go from autonomy to internomy. You know, so you need, from the origin, you want internomy of person. But if you say this is autonomy of person, of individual person, it's wrong from the beginning. So the concept of autonomy is the modern concept which stresses this individualism. Yeah. And I just wonder if you can really go to the end of your interpretation if you still keep this individualistic concept. Mm-hmm. And if you do not change it for internomy instead of autonomy.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Well, first, let me justify a little bit the reason why we choose this perspective.
Sorry, just one more thing. It's not a criticism of the application on your case. I mean it from the general point of view of social philosophy. Of course, when I would analyze this topic, I would follow a similar track as you did. But I mean, if we think about that in general terms, then, and if we would like to go further in a normative way, then we should change it to internomy from autonomy.
No, I think it could be also an objection, and a reasonable objection. Let's put it. I'll try to answer like this. During, I will relate to the research, but then I will go on the more philosophical level. So during the research, what we noticed was that this person we interviewed, severe poor women, they never saw themselves as part of a larger group or class, like the poor. It was always about their individual destiny. So when we or family, yes, this is already something. This is already something. It is already collectivity. Yes, you are right. But in most cases, they will really talking about themselves. So how they experience these, how they live through this experience of receiving regular monetary income for the first time in their life as individuals. Then, of course, they related this to this familial dimension. Yes, but independently. So do you have this phenomenological aspect? You know, individuals tend, and not only them. I mean, we all tend to see ourselves as individuals. So I would say you have first this everyday experience in which we tend to see ourselves as individuals. On the other side, you can say not only with reference to this poor person that none of them is really an individual from this point of view, because of course we belong to specific social groups, often to different social groups at the same time. So that in this sense, from this point of view, our individual autonomy depends from the kind of autonomy that these social groups have within a specific society. And then my answer would be to say yes, precisely. So you have in a sense, let's say a dialectic between these two dimensions, because we are never really individuals. We are only representative of social groups. But on the other side, we experience ourselves always as individuals. So we are, in a sense, it's like, we should look at ourselves as representative of a group, but unavoidably we see ourselves as individuals. So this, when we use this concept of autonomy and we try to look at this intersubjective dimension, it was an attempt to conciliate, so to say, these two perspectives. But then, of course, you conciliate them from a third point. So the neutral observer see, okay, you think it's your problem, but it is not your problem. It is actually the problem of the social group. I see this. But I am the social theorist, the social philosopher, so I come from another perspective.
But from the deepest point of view, all neo-Hegelian perspectives see, in fact, not just individuals, but interduals, you know.
Yes,
so
yes, I see this. I see that, but
each
you know,
individual is basically interdual.
But remember that even Hegel has precisely this distinction between, you know, the in itself, for itself, and for in itself. And it is only the philosopher, in his case, who knows how things really are. Individuals has always a very partial experience of what they really are. So that's what Hegel would say. Well, you know, the fact that people tend to see themselves as individuals, and therefore to think of themselves as more or less autonomous and so on, it's part of the way they see themselves, but this is the partial view. Me, the philosopher, I know that actually they are something different. They are representative of a specific...
Is it not this specific case of Western modernity, which is not case too much of Japanese modernity, Indian modernity, Chinese modernity,
Absolutely.
Sub-Saharan
Absolutely,
modernity?
of course.
People see themselves more as interduals than individuals. You know, this is typical for the West to
Yes.
see itself as an individual.
Absolutely,
Right?
I agree with you. So that's why, you know, we are talking about the interpreter of Western modernity. Smith, Hegel, Simmel, yeah. And in a sense, Brazil, it is the South, but
still
it
more,
still belongs to the Western tradition.
but more intersubjective, I would say, because of
The
various
woman,
reasons.
yes, the woman, yes. But mainly only in the sense of defining their autonomy in terms of the freedom, let's say, of the family, or in terms of family duties. Which, for instance, according to many feminist critics also of this program, is not autonomy. So they will say these women think they are free, they are not, because they are obeying to the logic of patriarchat and so on and so on. Which is, of course, also true in a sense, but on the other side, maybe it's, you know, trying to expecting too much from this situation. So from this point of view, I agree with you completely. It is a Western point, it's a classical Western point of view, it's Western modernity, and then, once again, I think that there is this dialectic between the individual experience on the one side and what the social theorists can see as being this more collective dimension. And I think it is unescapable.
Interdual.
Or yes, interdual, I would say. Yeah, you like this word? Yes, we can use it. Yes, yes, you're right. I think Stjanek.
There is a question?
Stjanek?
Well, from the discussion that I see here, and it might be completely wrong, it seems to me that many of us here are somewhat unsettled by the fact that money plays, let us say, important role in determining our freedom or our autonomy or autonomy, although I don't think that what Marek is saying really applies, but that's besides the point. But what is the alternative? What is the actual working alternative that you can propose? Because if I'm going to relate to this discussion to someone outside of this room, they are going to tell me, well, of course, you know, money is sort of helps to extend my freedom or my autonomy. Like, what's the discussion about? What's the problem? Or what's the alternative solution? Like, do you have any alternative solution? Because to me, also, this helps to legitimize the current capitalist structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. I mean, Simmel was not critical of capitalism, at least not in the same sense as Marx. He was critical of certain aspects of capitalism. but not of capitalism as a whole. What is the alternative? Well, I don't know. I'm not, let's say, I'm still trying to understand. I'm still, let's say, in the explanatory phase, if you want. I'm really trying to understand how this works, how money creates autonomy, and what does it mean? What are the backlash? What are the negative aspects of this? So I can't at present offer you an alternative. On the other side, I wouldn't think that there is no alternative, so to say, just to use a slogan, because historically, at least, we had many societies in which, let's say, the social roles that individual plays, and therefore what we could call their level of autonomy or freedom or whatever term you want to use, was defined not by monetary relation, but by other kinds of relations. So of course, there have been historically also alternatives to money. That doesn't mean that they were better, they were just different. So if we go back to Simmel, when he talks about pre-modern societies, he points to the fact that in this case, the space of individual freedom was defined by personal ties, which were not of monetary nature. Like, again, the allegiance of the subject to the liege, or the fact of pertaining to a specific religious community, and so on and so on. So that money might be a source of individual freedom is, once again, something specific of Western modernity. It is not a natural state. So if you ask me what is the alternative now, here, I don't know, because we are still living under the condition of modernity in a Western society. So of course, there is an alternative at present here to this solution, but it is not a natural solution in the sense that it is not something unavoidable. We had different way of defining the space of individual freedom or autonomy, and we might have different way. But if you ask me which way could be an alternative now, in this society, I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, really, I don't have an answer.
Perhaps some specific kind of knowledge, which is not based on such conditions of some kind of country or region, which gives you quite the possibility to move everywhere, not be based somewhere, not be citizen of any society, like the top managers, for example, or IT specialists. They move from cosmopolitan.
Well, but as long as you need money to satisfy your needs, your basic needs, and as long as you need money to live your life, you still depend on income. Doesn't matter if you are a top manager, a cosmopolitan academic, going to different academic world, you know, South America, Europe, North America, Asia. The fact that you move around different societies and without being at home, let's say, in none of them really, but belonging to one of these global classes, as Rorty said, there are only two global classes, the super rich and the academics. Still, you need money. Still, you depend on money. So probably the alternative would imply that we have a society which is not centered on market. So, not that where there is no market. In every society there was some form of market. The point is, we are in a market society. That means everything goes through the market. and everything is seen through the market's eyes. But market society has a history, once again. It has been born in Western societies, more or less at the end of the Renaissance, beginning of modernity, and then it has really become a full-fledged market society, probably only in 20th century. So, many other cultures, many other societies had different ways of defining this base of individual freedom. Some of them were really stress much more this intersubjective dimension. So that's why this claim that there is no concept of individual for antiquity, or each stage in society doesn't consider the individuals, they only look at the collective. This is not true, of course. There is the individual. Also in antiquity, I mean, you have the tragedies, you have the whole ancient literature show that there are individuals. The point is, there is a different way of establishing the relation between the individual and the group. But of course you have individuals. So they are not our individual, let's say.
Is really market the main principle today? I'm not sure, because I think the market as a main principle was in the beginning of capitalism. But of course, if you have companies within market, their natural tendency, or not natural in the literary sense, is to monopolize part of the market and to cancel market. So why do we have anti-monopoly agencies in all the Western companies, countries? Just to save market, because otherwise it would not exist here anymore. And in the beginning of capitalism, yes, there were many companies, and market was supposed to be the main principle for organizational allocation of goods. But then more and more monopolies and oligopolies took over, and they controlled the situation in the market. And as I said, Western companies tried to save at least some remains of market. So in fact, those who talk about market society, they mean property society, the big property society, which is a crucial principle in our society. So it means a tendency to oligarchy. So we live, I would say, not too much in market societies, but more in oligarchic societies.
Okay, then maybe I should reformulate.
But I
talk about the market. I was
the basis of your argument, which is beyond market anyway.
Now, let's put it like this. Okay, I use the term market in a very unspecified meaning, not in this very specific meaning. Maybe I could use Adorno's idea of the principle of exchange. You know, when you say you have a society which is really based on the principle of exchange, which is the basis of monetary relations. So even if in an oligarchic society, let's say, you have this principle of exchange as the best, that means if you want something, you have to give something in exchange, and this is strictly established by specific rules, which might differ if you have a free market society or if you have a monopolistic society, but nevertheless, you know, you get what you want only if you pay a specific amount of money. So this idea that there is always a very strict correlation defined by, let's say, market-like mechanism, even when there is no real market. So this, let's put it like this then. So I'm more referring to this Adornian idea that modern Western society is based on this quid pro quo. Otherwise, you don't get what you need. You are not the person you want to be. You can live the life you want to live. You are forced to accept this logic and to follow this logic. So in this sense, maybe. Even when you don't have a properly functioning market in a Smithian sense, because also Smith is aware of the risk of monopoly and oligopolies. So
you have concepts also of market socialism, not only market capitalism, for example. No, you're right. Maybe, so let's call about this
Another question?
Maybe another contradiction between liberal theory represented here by Amartya Sen and Hegel would be that when you think of capability, right? I mean, if you ask the question, capability to what? Then Hegel's dialectic of master and slave would give us another perspective, right? Because it's not the master but the slave who has the biggest capability, that is to change the society, the status quo. So,
Yeah.
I already asked this question of him,
Okay.
and he said that he would reformulate in the intersubjective way Amartya Sen. So,
Yes.
so it's not Amartya Sen anymore. It's it's his
Amartya Sen is
intersubjective reinterpretation.
Yes, Hegelianizing Amartya Sen.
Yes, yes.
So that's why I say Amartya Sen has in itself just just offering a theory of action. And then you can give to this theory of action different normative flavors, so to say. Most of them tend to be very liberal. But you could try to give this reinterpretation, which is a way also of actualizing Hegel. Because, you know, of course, maybe you don't need Sen, you just go directly to Hegel like Honneth does. But then you have a problem. If you want to be Hegelian, I think that you have to buy the whole packet. So you can't say, I am being Hegelian, but I don't want his metaphysics and I don't want his philosophy of history. That's very difficult. That's why Honneth, for instance, is...
Neo-Hegelian.
Yeah, well, but Honneth still has a philosophy of history in some sense. Because in Freedom's Right, he talks about this, I don't know how this is translated in English, Fehlentwicklung, like, you know, a development which went wrong. Like, it was going in the right direction, and then there was some deviance. Well, this is a philosophy of history, an implicit philosophy of history. Yes, but but there is the pathology, and then you have this Fehlentwicklung. These are two different things that you have in Honneth. So the pathology is okay, it is also problematic, but at least you don't need a philosophy of history. It's very static. You have, you know, the health society and the pathological society, which is also problematic, but at least it is a static view. While if you talk about Fehlentwicklung, it means, you know, there was a development which was right, and then you had the deviation. So there is here a philosophy of history. And if you take Sen and if you try to make out of Sen some Hegelian, which he is not, I mean, he is not Hegelian at all, he is liberal, then you can at least avoid this risk of having to buy the metaphysical and...
But you can have also post-metaphysical concept of history.
It's
not necessary.
No, it's not necessary. No. The concept of this is not necessarily metaphysical. But the fact that Honneth think that we were having progress, and then at a certain point we deviated. So at least, you know, you need the concept of an idea of progress, a positive idea.
Post-metaphysical.
Post-metaphysical, so there is no necessity of having progress. There is no history with capital H and so on. But at least there is at least a story of progress. This is what Honneth tells us in his book. And it is also very problematic because, of course, he is focusing, like Hegel, not only on Western society, I would say on German society from a certain point of view. So that's why I think that if you... Sen is interesting because he's a liberal author, so he's, in a sense, close to traditional normative political theories, but at the same time he distantiates himself from, say, John Rawls, precisely because he doesn't want to have this abstract view of what justice is, of what individuals are, and he wants to be closer to reality. So I'm just trying to go a step farther than he's going, that he is willing to go and say, look, it is a small step, and then you are on Hegelian terrain, so to say, and you really define individuals in their identity, and therefore also in their freedom, according to the social conditions in which they live. And I don't have, like in Hegel, to take into account the moral development, the level, the historical level of development they have reached. I can just describe it very neutrally, like saying, look, in this society, like for instance in Brazil, you know, there is this view. I wouldn't say that therefore Brazilian society is more backward than Norway. I would just say it's a different society because it has a different history. While Hegel would say, you know, it's different because, you know, they are backwards.
So perhaps one small step for Pinzani, but
it's a big step for Sen in any case. Yes.
Maybe we may say that Amartya Sen, because he has no concept of history, he didn't make too much progress, in fact. But we all think that you made a wonderful progress in your lecture here, even if you don't believe too much in an idea of progress.
Okay. So on this we can agree.
It would be also a nice
The last one.
word of our session if there are no other questions.
So, to your progress.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Marek, of course, and Alessandro. Thank you very much.